Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Post Political Podcast. I'm the host, Derek Britton, and I hope you all are doing well on this Tuesday evening. I'm glad we got a couple of podcasts for you this week. We have today we have Cathy, and then later on in the week, we'll have Nancy Rivera with Bridge Kids Get Back. So this will be a good week of shows. First off, let's get to the promos. We have the Vermin Supreme Institute. Our purpose is to inspire social evolution through the disruption of authoritarianism, to promote compassion and activism, and to spread the knowledge of redacted history. Through the use of humor, direct action, and mutual aid, we uplift the disaffected, the disenfranchised, and the disempowered. And very, very happy to announce the Love in Action fundraiser we did to help the folks in Reno, Nevada, and the homeless camps there. Went off this last weekend really well. Everything was distributed, and then on Tuesday, they were actually able to distribute some extra supplies and kind of some of the coats and stuff to some folks at one of the local food banks. So that was very successful, and I thank you all for those who donated and those who helped out. Big shout out to Chris Rogers and Chris Atkinson. They both did a lot of work kind of getting this ready logistically, and yeah, it went off really well. So thanks to everyone who supported that. And next up, we have Brewed Coffee down in Lexington, Kentucky. If you're down there, check out the Brewed Coffee and Beer Drinkery. I'll put my affiliate link as well in the comments so that you can go and, support the podcast, but also support the local business with, you can buy mug shirts, hats, all that stuff there. So that's Brewed Coffee down in Lexington, Kentucky. And lastly, we are doing the promo with the Trans Resource Network of Louisiana. We are doing the Be Gay, Do Crime promo. So you can buy any one of these 3 pieces of merchandise here, and 100% of the proceeds will go to the Trans Resource Network of Louisiana. And if you don't want any of the merchandise, you can go right directly to that PayPal link there and donate. And they are providing some housing and some just mutual aid in general to the trans and gender non-conforming folks down in New Orleans. All right. So now we can introduce Cathy. So her writing has appeared in places like TechCrunch, Vice, Reason, The Daily Beast, and tons of other publications. She's been quoted in the New York Times and a few others. We're going to talk about Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, FOSTA, which is the Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act, and how to best decriminalize sex work. So let's bring in Cathy. How you doing?
I'm well. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, thanks for joining. I'm super happy to, kind of dive a little bit into some policy and also just try to understand, some of the, especially you look at some of the names, as I'm reading these off, I'm thinking about this in my head. It sounds like, many different policies that we've seen introduced into Congress. They may name something that they don't typically actually do, and they can actually have some counter effects to some of these things. So I'm just excited in general, and I'd love, I'm excited that you can jump on in and discuss some of this with us. So I'd like to, first off, get you to introduce yourself and kind of how you found your way, I guess, to the third party or wherever you are politically, and kind of what was your journey, I guess, to get here?
Yeah, totally. So I'm a writer and activist. I have a Substack, cathyreisenwitz.substack.com. My newsletter is called Sex of the State, and my mission is to destigmatize and decriminalize all things sex. I grew up Southern Baptist in Alabama, very conservative, and I remember a couple inflection points in my political journey. One was I was in a politics, it was Constitution and Federalist Papers class in college. And I don't know, I feel like the conservative ecosystem was very pro-democracy in my, growing up years. I'm 35. And so I remember reading the Federalist Papers about how democracy done too much can be problematic, right? It runs into issues of kind of the many taking from the few. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And then I stumbled across Ron Paul videos at some point in college. And a friend of mine said, and I was posting about them oh, this is so interesting. And she said, if you like Ron Paul, you would like the Mises Institute and Reason.
Yep.
So I started reading Reason, and I was like, well, I really like their free markets and limited government stuff. I don't know about the sex and drugs situation though. And so I started reading on and got really educated about the drug war and the war on sex workers and nanny statism. And yeah, then I became a full-throated libertarian, started volunteering with Campaign for Liberty, and got really involved in the Ron Paul 2012 campaign.
Yep.
And then it became about like, okay, like this is a consistent ideology of limited government, personal freedom, free markets, economic growth. I love it. So personal autonomy. So how do we get this ideology and these principles and these ideas in front of more people? Specifically, why are women and ethnic minorities underrepresented in libertarianism? And so I'm a marketer by training, and I thought, I really want to market libertarianism to these underserved groups. And so I started to get into, I've like been a feminist for a long time, and over the years I've become more and more anti-racist. And so then I was trying to find the ways that libertarianism really connected to feminism and anti-racism, which led me to, now I'm really strongly focused on sex positive feminism and kind of like free market, economic freedom, where these things kind of personal autonomy, self-ownership, like where these things kind of come together. And so that's kind of where I'm at now.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You were talking about right towards the end there. One of the things that I recently, or I guess it was late last year, I saw you on was the Feminists for Liberty consent culture talk, which it was incredible. I mean, I watched through a couple of times. I have a few folks that I know as well that were talking during that, and it really, I feel like for so long, guns and taxes had been the focus of libertarianism that a lot of folks kind of drowned in that and weren't able to come out of it understanding more than just that piece of it. I feel like there's such a broader application of libertarian ideals, especially in, not only just consent in a section. We just lost Cathy. Hopefully she comes right back. But yeah, I'm just going to finish my thought real quick. Just her talk, I recommend people go and check it out. It's on the Feminists for Liberty YouTube channel. And they did an entire thing on consent culture, how libertarianism is kind of focused around consent culture and what we can do to kind of influence folks who are interested in that consent culture with libertarian ideals, and showing that the application is really there to kind of combine the two and be able to have broader conversations among consent and kind of help defining what that consent means outside of just a sexual relationship. So it's very, very good. I recommend folks go and check it out. That was actually probably one of my first 5 kind of exposures to Cathy and some of the work that she's done. But it looks like she's coming back now. Yep.
So sorry.
No worries. I just kind of finished my thought. I was just talking, basically telling folks to go check that out on the Feminists for Liberty YouTube channel, because I thought it was incredible. And just even trying to help define and apply consent culture, to more things than just sexual relationships was a really interesting topic, and I really enjoyed it. So I just kind of recommended folks go check that out. And I think that can kind of lead us into, so I brought you on to talk a little bit about a few different things that I've seen you talk about, not only on YouTube and Twitter, but I've kind of followed the links that you've shared and try to read up on it my own. But the first off was Section 230 in the Communications Decency Act. And let's start off with trying to let folks know what that is and kind of what Congress or some members of Congress are introducing for legislation to try and change that.
Yeah, it's a big question, and I will try to be accurate and also clear, which is often at odds. But essentially, Section 230 was a part of the Communications Decency Act. I think it was the only part that passed. It was written by Ron Wyden, and the idea was essentially without Section 230, platforms have two choices. They can either extremely heavily moderate and be responsible for everything that users do on their platform. So, for example, if I do anything illegal on Facebook, then Facebook would be liable for me having done that. And so what Facebook would have to do, if that were the legal standard, is basically pre-approve everything that goes up on their website before it goes up to make sure it's not breaking any laws.
Right.
The other option is to say platforms can't moderate at all. So you don't have to be liable for what users do on your platform if you just let anything go. And so that's why like 4chan and these other platforms that don't do any moderation at all don't have legal problems, because they can't be responsible for making moderation choices because they're not making any.
Right.
And so Section 230 basically allows platforms to moderate based on their own desires and their own terms of service. And so what legislators are trying to do, and have the first successful Section 230 carve out, was SESTA FOSTA, which was passed in 2018.
Right.
And it says platforms are allowed to moderate and aren't legally liable for what people do on their platforms, except if we can make a case that it has anything to do with sex trafficking. And so the problem with this is that because sex trafficking is so broadly defined, that anything really to do with sex could be construed as sex trafficking, especially if there's any money involved.
Right.
And so what platforms did in response to SESTA FOSTA passing is simply purge vast quantities of all sex-related content, and especially booted sex workers off their platforms, which has led to sex workers dying because they are not able to screen clients and share safety tips.
Right.
Sex educators have been deplatformed after SESTA FOSTA. So Section 230, I mean, the kind of little tagline is like it's what made the internet, right? It's what made these platforms able to moderate to the extent that they want to. And so the more that we encroach on Section 230, the more we force platforms to either extremely heavily moderate or pull back from any moderation whatsoever.
Yeah, and I think that's where I've seen a lot of the I guess bipartisan support for this bill. So you have I heard about this first when it was brought up by Donald Trump and kind of that whole side of things to kind of completely unmoderate the internet. If folks are being pulled off for saying things that they wanted folks to say, then that's wrong, and we should not allow Facebook to they wrongly said to infringe on the First Amendment, when in reality it's a private business doing whatever they want to do in their own space. But I don't want to get too deep into that, but I think this is common among a lot of legislation that does get put forward. Is you're trying to do something to protect certain people, or you're trying to do something to help a certain group, or a certain person that is being treated poorly, or their rights are being infringed upon, and it can lead to unintended consequences where folks can take especially how it's being used by lawyers, and how it's actually being used in I guess everyday litigation. So
I think one of the big problems is that people don't like social media's moderation policies, and some of their complaints are legitimate and some of their complaints are not legitimate. There's absolutely no evidence of widespread censorship of conservative views, in particular by social, like that's just not actually a thing that's happening if you look at any kind of empirical analysis. But people are absolutely right that platforms are arbitrarily and without much transparency moderating the content. So a good example is like, sex workers or sex educators who are not violating terms of service are still being kicked off, and they're not given any explanation or any ability to appeal. So anyway, people don't like the moderation policies. And so when they don't like what users are doing on the platforms, such as spreading misinformation, doing illegal things like they and and the DOJ gets all kinds of complaints about illegal activities, but they're not actually investigating 99% of those complaints. And so because the DOJ isn't doing their job, people want to force platforms to do the DOJ's job. So you have a lot of people who want to punish platforms, and what they keep running into is Section 230 prevents them from punishing these platforms. And so they're saying to legislators, well, we need to get rid of or make carve-outs of Section 230 so that I can get my way with these platforms. Right. And legislators are, instead of pushing back against that and saying, well, actually, that would lead to more problems than it solves, they're just being cowardly and not thinking about it and being like, oh, okay, yeah, let's carve out Section 230.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a great explanation for it, and it's interesting to me, how, like you said, this piece of policy really did kind of form the internet, and that's all of the reading that I've done previous to the talking to you about this. That's almost how every one of those articles has started. Is this is what really started the internet, started a lot of how policy shaped the internet, I guess. And my question is how do we, I guess, what would be the right thing to do? Is leave it alone, or is it to reinstate it, I guess, to its original intent? Or, what is your personal opinion, I guess, on how do we make this work for, I guess, the let the market or let people be able to decide what platform they want to be on? It's a hard question. I don't know if there's a perfect answer for this. I just kind of wanted your opinion on what you feel about it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to sit here and say the status quo is good. Like, it's not. Like, some people's complaints are illegitimate, but a lot of people have very legitimate complaints about the way content is moderated on the internet right now by dominant platforms, for sure. But I think that we should look at, this is kind of one of my hobby horses, is I think we should look at the empirical evidence for and against legislation before and after it passes when we're considering it. And when we look at the first and only major carve out of Section 230, SESTA FOSTA, and its impact on everything, it's been extremely bad, right? So before it even passed, law enforcement said, this is actually going to make our lives more difficult, because right now, when sex trafficking is happening online, users and platforms are reporting it to us. And so we now have a window into potential sex trafficking that we can investigate. Yep. If SESTA FOSTA passes, then these instances of sex trafficking will then go further into the dark web, where we have a harder time identifying them. Platforms will have the incentive to simply delete users as opposed to reporting the instances. This is going to make our lives harder. And by every piece of evidence I'm familiar with, it has made actually prosecuting sex trafficking more difficult since SESTA FOSTA passed. In addition, like I said, it's been a horrible thing for sex workers. It's made our lives more dangerous, more difficult. And so it's also made it more difficult for everyday people to access sex education and good information about sexuality, which is kind of important. In the wake of SESTA FOSTA, people had their Google Drive files deleted without any warning or explanation, because they contain supposedly contained, but it didn't even have to, right? Sexual imagery. And so, considering how bad the first carve out of Section 230 has been, I can't really say that I have any reason to expect further Section 230 carve outs to be an improvement on the situation.
No, and I think it's important for folks to understand and know, like you said, and I so I'm an engineer by day, so empirical data is something I completely, I believe in to a fault sometimes. So I think it's a good point that in general, legislation that does get passed or is on the table to be passed, you should be able to look at how this could impact things before and after. And
what a concept!
Relevant. What's that?
What a concept!
Exactly. And I mean, I think there's you have this kind of you're at odds with politics, I guess, at that point, because politics are very emotional, and you're trying to get people to not only elected officials, but individuals who are electing these officials to vote with their hearts and not their minds. And oftentimes, like I said, you see some of these pieces of legislation hurting the folks that they're actually intended to try and help. And I guess more on that and trying to dive down even a little deeper into sex work. How do we not only allow folks to not only be in a lot of these platforms, but able to educate folks in a lot of these platforms, but also make sure that folks are safe and doing so, with their own, under their own consent, let's just call it. So.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's a reason that the WHO, World Health Organization, Amnesty International, the Lancet, all these organizations have said the key to keeping sex workers safe and clients safe is decriminalizing sex work. Because in every instance, whether it's drugs, sex, porn, whatever it is, criminalizing a market does not get rid of the market. People are always going to buy and sell sex. People are always going to buy and sell drugs. The only thing criminalization does is make it more dangerous. And that's absolutely true of sex work, right? If I go into a Walgreens and buy Tylenol, I know that the brand has a reputational risk that if they sell me bad drugs, like that's going to be bad for them. If I buy drugs on the street corner where there's no reputation, there's no accountability mechanism, right? I don't have any assurance that these drugs are safe. Right. Same for sex workers and clients, right? If there's no centralized or at least reputational marketplace for me to identify clients beforehand, check to see what their reputation is, tell people who I'm meeting and where I'm meeting them, right? Then that's a more dangerous situation for me. And that's exactly what's happened, is that as we push sex work further and further underground, it's been more and more dangerous for sex workers to engage in it. And it hasn't limited it at all. The same amount of sex work is happening regardless. It's just more dangerous for everyone involved. And so it's really important that sex workers be able to identify and screen clients ahead of time, share safety information online, and report their assaults to police, right? That's one of the biggest problems with criminalization of sex work, is that when sex workers and their clients have a adversarial relationship with police, then that creates a situation in which violence can happen more often and with fewer consequences.
Right. No, and that's I think one of the big pieces that I've heard personally from folks is the lack of ability to do anything about a severely dangerous situation that could occur. There's really there's no one to turn to at that point, because, and that's pushed a lot of really dangerous practices and I guess hierarchical structures, I guess, within sex work, instead of having it more out in the open and having it able to be reported upon and done so in a market that is without that severe power differential, I guess.
Right, exactly. So Kamala Harris said, I potentially am open to the idea of decriminalizing selling sex, but I don't think that it should be legal for pimps to do their thing, right? Well, Kamala Harris is a co-sponsor of SESTA FOSTA. And after SESTA FOSTA passed, tons of sex workers went back into pimps' control, because that became the only way that they could have any safety when they were working. Right. Whereas before, they were working for themselves, they were finding clients online, they were screening clients online. Being kicked off of those platforms, they then had to go back to pimps for the same protection. Right. So we've empowered pimps by disempowering sex workers, by making it harder for us to find and screen clients online.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and that's awful. Yeah, I one of the pieces as well that I noticed, and I was unaware of this and kind of ignorant to this before seeing. I think it was something that you had put on, one of the social media platforms, was about decriminalization versus legalization. and what the difference is and what those might mean to sex workers in the future. If we were to, and I, like I said, I was completely ignorant of this, and I'm still fairly ignorant of this, but I've learned slowly that decriminalization seems to be the better path. And I just wonder, can you kind of explain why that is, I guess, and kind of the differences between the two?
Totally, yeah. Essentially, the difference is decriminalization just means that there are no criminal charges for buying or selling or facilitating sex work. And so I just want to make a note here that proponents of what's called the Nordic model or the Swedish model or end demand are calling what they're advocating for decriminalization. It's not. Decriminalization means fully decriminalizing. So decriminalization is in contrast to legalization, where you have a generally highly regulated anti-competitive market, right, where essentially you have like a few brothels that are operating legally, and then everyone else still operates in a fully criminalized market. And so then you kind of have a situation where some sex workers work for these brothels where there's not a lot of competition. And so the brothels have a lot of control over the sex workers, and the sex workers are having to hew to regulation that's generally pretty strenuous, like, testing regimes that aren't really practical and maybe expensive, or, just different regulations that aren't necessarily set up for safety, but are more about keeping incumbents entrenched and preventing newcomers from entering the marketplace. And so you still have a good amount of sex trafficking in a legalization framework, because you have so many sex workers that choose not to or can't work for the brothels. And so they still operate in the black market. And so for those reasons, most sex workers advocate a full decriminalization model where they are allowed to work for themselves, or they can contract with other people, but it's up to them. And they get to choose, their working hours and the clients that they take. And, for example, some brothels will penalize sex workers for not accepting certain clients. And in a decrim model, sex workers would be in charge of these kinds of decisions. So for these reasons, sex workers generally prefer decrim to legalization.
Yeah, and I mean, I've seen it play out personally in the state of Massachusetts with marijuana. So they legalized, and there was a lot of folks, and I was, again, ignorant of kind of the differences between the two. And I was like, why are these pro cannabis folks against the way that we want to legalize marijuana in Massachusetts? And I never understood it until after it passed, and saw, it's like 3 companies that own basically all of the shops and grow facilities now in Massachusetts. And it's a very select few that weren't the folks that were being harmed by the policies before. It's folks that were benefiting off of those policies before and now benefiting off of those afterward. And it's still, there's still a very common and fruitful, I guess, black market still all over the place in Massachusetts. And like I said, this one example, but I've seen it, play out right before our eyes very clearly. And like you said, it almost, and we see this with highly regulated markets in general, that you see a power shift. There's a lot more power that's being put in place with the folks that have the means to set up these massive facilities of being able to control and meet all. I mean, usually to meet the regulation, you need a lawyer or two to understand the regulation before you can get there. So that cuts out the individual that just wants to enter the marketplace on their own.
Yeah, I don't know so much about Massachusetts, but I live in California, and California obviously has a thriving black market in cannabis, and a ton of regulations that have absolutely no bearing in science whatsoever, around like purity and growing conditions, that are really purely about entrenching a few dominant players and keeping out any kind of competition. So I think it's fairly analogous. I think that it's less analogous in that I think a legalization framework is actually better for cannabis than for sex work, because when you're just buying a product off the shelves, I think that reputational, the brand can be really useful. Yep. Whereas I think with sex work, it's just harder to see how consolidating into these mega businesses would be like a benefit to buyers or sellers, really. But yeah, it's a similar issue where you've got silly regulations that are anti-competitive and smaller players kept out, and in a thriving black market. And high prices as well. California has really high prices.
Yeah, and Massachusetts is seeing the same thing, and that's what's keeping the black market, thriving. And it's partially due to, like you said, the regulation that's just not based in science. It's there's thoughts on taxing it based on potency and things like that. Like just real, and like you're hurting folks who need it for pain. Typically, those high potency strains are used for pain management. You're hurting the folks who actually need it for medical, a strong medical case. Yeah, it's just there's a lot of issues, I guess, around the heavy regulation in that market. And it's interesting to see, like you were saying, how that branding structure and kind of consolidating some of that. I can kind of see how in a cannabis market or something else like that, where you're buying a product or a good like that, it's very different than buying sex work or anything. That kind of transaction, I guess, is really not condoning to that. So that it's like I said, I'm trying to learn as much as I'm trying to help folks in the audience learn. So I appreciate you going through all of this and kind of explaining each piece.
Yeah, I enjoy it.
Yeah. So one of the last things I wanted to make sure we talk about is we've talked about a couple of things that we can I think especially the Section 230 carve outs and stuff. I think the more people who know about that, I don't see it talked a ton outside of either the porn or sex work industry. I've seen it come up here and there with like Patreon and a few other places like that, where the platforms are really pushing for no more carve outs, I guess, to the Section 230. But trying to help let folks know what to fight, I think is a big piece of what I'm trying to do here. But also, how can we, what pieces of beyond, and maybe it's just decriminalizing sex work. I guess that could be the answer here. But what could we do at kind of local levels and state levels to put forward legislation on, if those states that have, ballot measures they can vote on and things like that during election season. What are some of the pieces of legislation, I guess, that you would push to help make the lives of sex workers better?
Yeah, I mean, definitely any bills to decriminalize sex work I think are great. I believe Oregon is debating a bill to decriminalize sex work right now. There's a group called Decriminalize Sex Work that's working across the country to implement bills to decriminalize sex work. I think another issue is getting DAs, district attorneys in place, prosecutors in place who don't prosecute people for sex work. And so I think her name is Eliza Orleans, is running for DA in New York. And she has said that like the war on sex work is failing and making sex trafficking worse, and she's not going to be part of that. I think it's important to note that the war on sex workers is incredibly racist as well, just like the war on drugs is, that it primarily targets sex workers of color, particularly trans sex workers of color, that the arrests for prostitution are disproportionately conducted in poor and minority neighborhoods. And that, again, it has absolutely no impact on the amount of sex work that happens, and it doesn't make sex work conditions better, it makes them far worse. So yeah, I think one of the most underappreciated levers that we have for making our society more just is prosecutors and district attorneys. We need to elect or appoint, I think they're all, I don't know if they're all elected, but we need to get them in place, people who are evidence-minded, right? Like, are these policies working, or are they making life significantly worse for everyone involved? So yeah, decriminalize sex work, get pro criminal justice reform prosecutors in place, and just fight against these incursions into personal liberty. Like, for example, Utah just passed a bill that requires all tablets and phones sold to someone who lives in Utah to come with a porn filter built in and turned on by default. So it's not clear that the governor is going to sign the bill, and once the governor does sign the bill, if he does, it will likely be struck down by the courts. But still, like, it's absolutely absurd that we elect representatives who are pushing forth this kind of anti-empirical, moralizing, anti-free market, anti-First Amendment, like, bullshit. I think that a lot of people, when they look at legislators, they're like, how pro-business are they? What's their stance on abortion? What's their stance on gun control? It's like, what's your stance on civil liberties? Like, what's your stance on, what's your stance on evidence-based policy? Like, are you taking actual empirical evidence into account when you're putting forth policy? And I think that legislators that put forth policy that is clearly demonstrably pernicious to society, like that, there should be a political cost to that. That's just my thought.
Well, and you brought up a good point too. I mean, a lot of these policies that are being put forward and even that are getting voted on and voted in to be challenged by the courts, that's costing taxpayers money to do so. And it's merely just, it's not like the elected official has no idea that it's going to be struck down. They know it's going to be struck down. They're doing it for political points. They're getting these, like we were talking about before, these emotional points that they're against porn, let's say in this case in Utah. And at the end of the day, all of that churn, the votes that, that the time that those folks had to go and sit in, that's all taxpayers' money. And that's all doing things that are not helping society, that are not and like you said, they're not data driven. They're not doing anything good that can be proven, by any sort of metric.
Well, let's talk about the actual issues facing Utah, right? Like, porn is not in the top 20, right? Like, it's not like these legislators don't have real issues to address. They don't have real problems to address. They're just doing this because it's easy and because most people aren't willing to stand up and say, like, no, actually, porn is fine. And I have a right to access it on my devices. And device makers have a right to sell devices without porn filters installed if they want to. And so if you have like a very strong moralizing kind of special interest group and you don't have a countervailing force, then you get bad legislation. And so I'm just asking everyday people to like be that countervailing force and say like, no, this is bad legislation. There should be a reputational hit and an electoral hit to putting forth bad legislation that kowtows to these crazy special interest groups.
And I think that a big piece of that too is to, if you don't particularly feel passionate about the specific legislation, so take this porn piece, apply that to whatever you are passionate about. And think, would you buy a phone that limited, say you're big into working on your own car, that limited how much you could work on your own car because car manufacturers don't want you to do that anymore? How would you, react then? Just put yourself, and it takes a little bit of empathy, but it doesn't take a ton. It just takes a little bit of taking that logical thinking, I guess, to your particular set of interests and try to apply that to your civil liberties and think, how would that affect me and what would my opinion be on that? And fight it just as hard as you would fight it if it was impacting your specific passion or area of interest.
Totally. Or think about the principle of the issue.
Right.
Is it acceptable for a small interest group to force companies to hew to their moral objectives?
Yeah. It's definitely as simple as that. And I think, you hit on this when you started talking about the kind of what brought you to the Libertarian Party. And this kind of what brought me here as well is you can actually rely on principle. There's a principle set of values, I guess, that everything kind of goes around, and you can always apply that to whatever arguments kind of being brought up. And I always ask folks that are not part of a party that has that kind of central driven factor, how do you apply this to other things? Do you just look at the platform? Because, you know, in my opinion, there's no specific set values in every other not every other platform, but in some other platforms, there's not this particular set of values that you can kind of go back to. They have a stance on things as it comes at them. And that's very emotional and very, you know, it can very quickly get you into a place where you think you're helping someone and then you're actually hurting their civil liberties. So I wanted to make that connection because I feel like it was, it feels like it's a part of your driving force, I guess, behind your decisions and what you want to support and go up against as well. So
I definitely have a strong emotional draw to values and principles driven thinking. I'm kind of trying to work on it, honestly, but like, yeah, it's like, no, I should get to choose what I consume. I don't want the state telling me what I'm allowed to look at on my fucking phone. Like,
right.
that's a strong moral intuition I have had for a long time.
And that's great. I think this was, like I said, I probably learned as much or more than most of the folks watching this. So I really appreciate you coming on and talking about this. I want to give you a little bit of time here at the end to go through and kind of promote anything you'd like, or really talk about anything. It can be pertaining to this, you know, topic that we've covered or not. You know, kind of go and do what you want and kind of get your message out there.
Thank you so much. Yeah, my passion right now is my blog. I'm a writer first and foremost, and I've been writing on sex and the state. It is at Substack, so it's cathyreisenwitz.substack.com. If you could subscribe to me at the for your paid level, really appreciate it. If you can share my stories, like super appreciate it. I'm also on Twitter, way too much, at Cathy Reisenwitz. And then another way that I kind of try to support my work is through OnlyFans. So I'm an OnlyFans creator. I'm at onlyfans.com/Cathy Reisenwitz, and Facebook, Instagram, like Cathy Reisenwitz as well. But yeah, I'm also writing for AVN sometimes, doing some reporting on civil liberties and the porn industry and sex work. But yeah, like I'm just, you know, if you have any tips on stories that you think I should cover, or things that I should know, definitely interested in that. But yeah, my main thing is the Substack, and just trying to change the culture, change hearts and minds, to open people's eyes up to the ways that sex and pornography are just kind of default demonized in the culture.
Right.
And how like sex is inherently morally neutral, right? And so how do we deal with that as a society, and how do we govern that in a way that has positive outcomes? That's kind of my focus.
Yeah, and definitely, you know, one small piece to add is, you know, keeping people safe. I think that's one of the big things that we really need to keep in the back of our mind is, how is this going to affect the safety of another human being? No, like I said, I can't thank you enough. The amount of information that you gave, I'm going to go back and re-listen to this again just so I can learn a little bit more, and definitely check out. You know, I've checked out the Substack before. And I'm going to continue reading some of that as well. And I put the links in the comments so that folks can go on and do, you know, take a look at any of the stuff that you promoted. So I thank you again. You know, like I said, I learned a ton. I'd love to have you back on at some point. You know, I think there's a lot of different routes we can kind of head down this, you know, this path. And there's a lot of pieces of legislation when, you know, it comes to November timeframe. Now and then, especially next year, that we can go into specific pieces of legislation and stuff. So thank you very much. And I hope you have a wonderful night.
Thank you. You too. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. So that was Cathy Reisenwitz. And like I said, I learned so much from the conversation. I hope you all did as well. And I hope you all go to the links that I put in the comments, to the Substack and the OnlyFans. And if you enjoyed today's episode, you know, come back on Thursday. We're going to be talking to Nancy Rivera. She and her daughter actually started a group called Bridge Kids Give Back. And they're dedicated to feeding, clothing, and uplifting one homeless, unhoused community at a time. I've seen, her out in the middle of the week. She cooks and will gather, different clothing and comforters when it's cold and bring it around to the folks in the, Lowell Lawrence area, Boston, Worcester, kind of that whole eastern part of Massachusetts. And she does incredible work. I'm really excited to talk to her, and I hope you enjoyed tonight's episode of the Post Political Podcast. Thanks, everybody.